Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next session on removing barriers faced by Indigenous participants in inclusive sport and recreation. So we're basically going to discuss how some athletes actually may be doubly excluded. My name is Jenna Davey. I'm a graduate student here at the university, and my research focuses on connections to the land and culture within a sport context among urban Indigenous youth. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Tricia McGuire-Adams and Ms. Linda Robinson, our two speakers for this session. So Dr. Tricia McGuire-Adams is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation and Native Studies. Her CIHR-funded research looked to Anishinaabe ancestral and current stories of physicality to address ill health and provides a counter-narrative to deficit-based health research. Through her research, Tricia uses Anishinaabe research paradigm, and she created an Indigenous research methodology called Wisokotatuin, which means gathering together for a purpose. Wisokotatuin gathered urban Indigenous women together to participate in critical dialogues and engage in directed physical activity. Tricia's current program of research looks to Anishinaabe land-based learning and physical activities to further amplify Indigenous people's health and well-being. And secondly, Ms. Linda Robinson is a mother, grandmother, Indigenous woman, and polio survivor, and her passion is social justice. She was born and raised in Alberta and has always been active within the community while working full-time and raising two daughters as a single parent. She has played wheelchair basketball and currently curls with the Edmonton Rocks Wheelchair Curling Club. She has served as a board governor for the Bissell Center, a board member of the Elf Special Needs Society, as well as various other community organizations. She developed and co-facilitated the Understanding Disabilities Workshop at the Alberta Federation of Labour Human Rights Conference. Working with Amnesty International and the Lubicon Cree Nation at Little Buffalo, Linda helped raise awareness of the issues facing the Lubicon Cree and also helped raise funds for a local hockey arena for the youth of Little Buffalo. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tricia McGuire-Adams and Mrs. Linda Robinson.
Good afternoon. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Treaty 6 Nations. This is the land known by the Cree as the Amiskwaci or Beaver Hills. It's a meeting and trading place for the people for thousands and thousands of years. So let me tell you a little about myself. My family and I were living in northern Alberta when I contracted polio. I was 19 months old and was medevaced to the General Hospital in Edmonton. I remained in the hospital for 2 years, and at the age of 4 was placed into the foster care system. To this day, I have no definitive answer as to why I was placed into care, but it's most likely because my family was in the north and I was in Edmonton, so going into foster care would have been the easiest solution for social services. The foster care system was not a good experience for me, and at a very young age, I set a goal for myself to get out of the system as soon as possible. At 16, I graduated high school and started my first job and left the foster care system behind me. But all through the public school system, I never participated in sports because there was no adaptive programs. In high school, phys ed was required in order to graduate. However, because there was no adaptive programs in my high school made me sit on the sidelines and watch the able-bodied kids. This was how I earned the necessary credits to get my diploma. I fell into wheelchair basketball quite by accident. At the time, I was not aware there was a women's team in Edmonton. I was approached one day by a fellow from the Alberta Northern Lights and asked if I'd be interested in trying wheelchair basketball. I thought this was exciting, so I registered, and the next thing I know, I'm playing for the women's team. It was a whole new experience for me because I never participated in sports before. I knew nothing about the game of basketball, let alone the specifics of wheelchair ball. It was a steep learning curve for me, and unfortunately, I did not receive coaching that took my lack of experience into consideration. I was expected to do the drills, know the drills, and participate fully in the scrimmages that were held at each practice. So for the first year, I basically followed along at each practice and hoped that I was getting it right. Any specific instructions I received came more from my teammates than from the coach. I showed up at each tournament and was given my obligatory 2 minutes on the court, but only if the team was far enough ahead so I wouldn't affect the play. 2 minutes barely gave you enough time to get a feel for what was happening on the court, let alone make any contribution to the play. So needless to say, when we ended up at nationals that year and the coach had to play me because I was the only player whose classification would work, it was quite terrifying. And to explain classification, each player is assessed on their disability and given a point value from 0 to 4.5 on that assessment. Adding up all 5 players on the court, their classification cannot add up to more than 19.5 points. So here I am in a major game with no practical experience. If it were not for my teammates, I swear I would still be this terrified being frozen in place on the court. In my 20 years that I played basketball, there was only one other player that identified himself as being Indigenous, and he was from BC. We never talked about being Indigenous ball players, but for me, I could clearly see the distinction between how he got involved and how I did, and how our life factors placed us at different perspectives. I guess the most important point was that he was with his family and not in the foster care system. This may sound harsh, but children in care rarely have opportunities beyond the basic necessities, and this is doubled for disabled children in care. I would like to be able to say that the reason Indigenous people with disabilities are not involved in sports is because they're not interested, but I can't. And I would like to say that the reason Indigenous people with disabilities are not involved in sports is because they're active in other areas, but I can't. I can say that Indigenous people with disabilities face more than just their disability if they want to participate in sports. Colonialism has affected every generation and every aspect of Indigenous people's lives and their culture since the signing of the treaties. This is reflected by the low number of Indigenous youth with disabilities who are able to participate in their communities and broader society. I think it's important to note that Canada's Indigenous people are the only ethnic group that is governed by federal government legislation, the Indian Act, an act that provides rights and benefits, including medical benefits, for those with good moral character. The Indian Act applies only to status First Nations. All other Indigenous groups, non-status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, fall under provincial jurisdiction. This is how the system is supposed to work, but in most cases, the lines get blurred. It is a continual fight for Indigenous people to access services. Provincial governments say it is a federal responsibility, and federal governments insist health care services are a provincial jurisdiction. Recently, after a number of years of lobbying by Cindy Blackstock, the First Nation Child and Caring Society, a bill was passed called Jordan's Principles. Jordan was a disabled child that never had the opportunity to be with his loving families because the 2 levels of government fought over who should pay for his care. Jordan died in a cold, sterile hospital. This bill stated that the first point of contact by an Indigenous family for services, that contact would provide the service to the family, and then the 2 levels of government would work out whose responsibility it was to pay for service. You would think this would have solved the problem. However, now the various levels of government argue over whether or not that disabled child falls under this jurisdiction, and many nations are not even aware of the legislation or how they can access it. So instead of being able to strive for the best quality of life you can, most Indigenous people with disabilities and their families expend all their energies attempting to get the basic necessities. For example, instead of providing a child with an appropriate-sized wheelchair, the child is given an adult-sized wheelchair that weighs about 70 pounds and told, "Don't worry, you'll grow into it." The child is now in a wheelchair too large for them to manage on their own and needs to be pushed everywhere they go, resulting in them not being able to become independent. Another example, last year my doctor and physiotherapy therapist recommended I begin using a wheelchair to ease the strain on my shoulders. INAC, which is Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, rejected the recommendation. I appealed and to date have not received a response or even an acknowledgement that my appeal has been received. I'm independent. For those who are independent, drive their own vehicle, or have access to bus or DATS service, you are able to participate to a greater degree. When I first started playing wheelchair ball, it was one of the only sports that had been adapted. Now a wide variety of sports have been adapted: hockey, tennis, athletics, rugby, fencing, and the list goes on. However, a lot of people don't realize that these sports have been adapted and who they need to contact to become involved. I know when I tell members of my community that I played wheelchair basketball, they are quite surprised, because most Indigenous communities think that adapted sports are only available to elite athletes that participate in the Paralympics. Not enough work is being done to promote adaptive sports in the Indigenous community. Isolation is also a key factor that prevents disabled Indigenous youth from participating in sports. Many reserves in Alberta are very far from larger centres like Edmonton, Calgary, where most programs are available. Another factor is that even today, Indigenous children with disabilities are more likely to end up in foster care than with their families. Contrary to popular belief, Indigenous children end up in foster care not because of neglect, but because of poverty. This presents a double whammy for Indigenous children with disabilities, thus making it easier for child services to place disabled children in care. Using my experience in foster care, I can say that most foster families aren't interested or don't have the time to provide sports activities for foster children, and particularly foster children with disabilities. So when you take all these factors into consideration, it's no wonder that disabled Indigenous youth are not highly represented in disabled sports at any level. What are the solutions? As a First Nation woman, I can only speak about what I see and how I feel. My perspective is that colonialism and paternalism still play a large role in the lives of Indigenous people. We as Indigenous people need to have the power and the resources to determine our own outcomes. The treaties need to be honored so that we have the necessary resources to provide for our communities. Our communities spend all our efforts and resources fighting what most Canadians take for granted. In this time of reconciliation, let us all work together so that Indigenous children with disabilities have the opportunity to remain with their families, so that Indigenous children with disabilities have the opportunity to participate in sports the same way non-Indigenous children do. Recommendations number 88 and 89 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission call for all levels of government to take action to ensure long-term Aboriginal athlete development and growth, and continued support for the North American Indigenous Games, including funding to host the Games and for provincial and territorial team preparation and travel, and call upon the federal government to amend the Physical Activity and Sport Act to support reconciliation by ensuring that policies to promote physical activities as a fundamental element of health and well-being reduce barriers to sport participation, increase the pursuit of excellence in sport, and build capacity in the Canadian sports system are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples. Though the recommendations don't speak directly about disabled youth, let us not forget them as we work towards a more inclusive world. Hi.
Miigwech, Linda, for your powerful testament today. Boju debiki jago kwe indigo mishkwa deze dodam namki wakwadan the donji bengwania shianishnaabek the donji. My name is Tricia, and I thank you, Jenna, for your kind introduction today. I'm Anishinaabe from Robinson Superior Treaty Territory in northwestern Ontario. I'm from the Turtle Clan. My community is Bengwania Anishinaabe, and I grew up in Thunder Bay, Ontario. I acknowledge my presence as an Anishinaabe resident in Amaskwachi, Waskahigan, or Edmonton, in Treaty 6 territory. I come to you today with a good heart, and I also acknowledge my white-passing, cisgendered, and able-bodied privileges that I carry. I'm eager to participate in this conversation with my friend Linda. I'm not a critical disabilities scholar, but an Anishinaabe scholar who looks to Anishinaabe ways of being and thinking to create counter-narratives to the settler colonial health deficit research concerning Indigenous people. I have started to see a number of parallels between health disparity research and the Western construct of disability, which is where I focus my conversation. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge that I am at the beginning of my learning in critical disability studies, and while I very much appreciate the kind invitation today, I'm very aware that I do not wish to speak for any person living with disabilities. I also acknowledge that I may make mistakes through my learning, and I hope to continue having these important conversations with community members who live with disabilities. And with humility, I apologize in advance for any mistakes that I may make. I'm framing my conversation points today from Laverna Laverne's recent article, Indigenous Perspectives on Difference, A Case for Inclusion. This article came out last year and is very, very timely. Based on her reading of Indigenous ways of being and Indigenous ways of thinking, she advances the argument where if we seek to challenge the Western colonial framework of disability as a logical dichotomy, we need to learn from Indigenous concepts of reciprocity and mind, body, and spirit connections. Laverne explained, while there is an uptake of inclusion, there is little, if any, effort to seek out and use Indigenous people's voices on Indigenous issues. What occurs most often, rather, are Western experts' interpretation of Indigenous values, cultures, and issues, whereby such policies as the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international and local documents most often, and I quote her, represent a Western document about global Indigenous communities rather than a document by global Indigenous communities and for Indigenous communities. This parallels the health disparity and disabled discourses in many ways. First, how many Indigenous health and Indigenous disability policies are by and for Indigenous communities? Not many. Second, settler colonial discourses of erasure and elimination are inherently embedded in such policies about Indigenous health and disability. For Indigenous people, disability is not a driver of inequality, but a result of it. A result of the effects of colonization and assimilation. As such, any conversation about Indigenous health and disability must critically examine colonialism and ongoing settler colonialism. Indeed, Laverne questioned the very premise of disability as being framed from a Western colonial construct. And I quote her, disability discrimination is a Western construct injected into Indigenous populations by colonization efforts and continued in post-colonization assimilation practices. Disability, viewed within an Anishinaabe and perhaps other Indigenous epistemological or ways of thinking and being lenses, gives a different perspective on inclusion. By learning from Indigenous concepts of community equity, reciprocity, and respectful relationships, a new way of thinking about disability emerges. Laverne clarifies that there was not a monolithic utopia experienced amongst any Indigenous community prior to colonization. However, we did have, quote, developed system of diversity equity that can be used to model developed systems of disability inclusion in underdeveloped Western cultures. Therefore, a concerted and mindful decolonization approach is necessary to clarify how Indigenous paradigms of difference may generate new ways of thinking about disability. This begs the question, how can Indigenous disability and health practitioners, researchers, and scholars implement discussions, policy, and research reflective of Indigenous epistemologies and needs? We have to learn to engage differently. Okay. As Laverne clarifies, quote,
Instead of attempting to eliminate disability issues within global Indigenous cultures using Western tactics, traditional Indigenous knowledges and practices should be employed within these communities to regain the equality that existed prior to colonization. And certainly from my own perspective, Anishinaabe concepts of wellness are not exclusionary. Our teachings are not located within binaries like abled and disabled. They are based within the fundamental values of respect, humility, truth, love, wisdom, honesty, and bravery. We follow an ethic of reciprocity, whereby everyone finds their own ways to give back to others, other persons and non-persons or non-humans, without harm, but with love and kindness. Anishinaabe have a responsibility to be well for our nations, our families, and for ourselves. This is enacted through our personal or holistic visions of well-being, through spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical. From this perspective, if a person is living with an impairment, that doesn't necessarily stop them from finding their well-being. They make sense of what well-being and strength means to them and enact it accordingly, as it is up to the individual to determine what balance and wellness looks like, not based on any able-bodied definition, but based on one's life experience and one's truth, and then also to be supported in their vision. For Indigenous communities, it does not matter if one is disabled or not. What matters is their desire, and this is a quote by Laverne I'll enter into. What matters is their desire to, quote, to fulfill their responsibilities to others to the best of their abilities. Differences of body or mind can be thought of in terms of talents. It is assumed that all individuals have talents and that it is the duty of each of those, the duty of each of us to determine these talents to support the community. The diversity of talents allows for the advancement of the survival of the community as a whole. The focus is then on the abilities of the individual rather than the inabilities, end quote. While we must look to Indigenous epistemologies or ways of thinking and being, we cannot discount the settler colonial erasure and assimilation afflicted upon Indigenous ways of being. We must actively engage in unraveling the colonizations of our minds and the treatment of others with differences, and to do so, we must ask ourselves difficult questions. Are our communities affected by colonial thinking to the extent where we treat our different community members in a Western disabled framework? Do our communities enact and fulfill the above noted, as I mentioned previous, Indigenous knowledge and practice? Laverne states, while the ability for Indigenous cultures and individuals to balance has been significantly hindered, and in some cases destroyed by colonization and post-colonization assimilation efforts, movements to reassert traditional ways of thinking and being continue. We must also ask how multiple intersections of oppression affect Indigenous peoples, as Linda so eloquently shared from her own story. For instance, informed by Greensmith, quote, systems of ableism often are steeped in settler colonial discourses of erasure and come into contact with racialized bodies, queer bodies, classed bodies, and gendered bodies, bodies that have already been affected by other and multiple forms of oppression, end quote. An intersectional approach will only help us tease out how ableism and settler colonialism is manifested in all of its insidious forms. Greensmith also recommends for us to look to race, concepts of nation, and colonialism as they all coincide with disability. This approach will then create a cohort of critical disability scholars and activists that can show how colonial oppression and ableism are within the nexus of settler colonial power in what is currently Canada. We have to engage differently. To end this conversation, what is needed then is a disruption of Western discourses of disability by a regeneration of Indigenous understandings of difference, where one is supported for their unique talents and gifts, irrespective of how their bodies or minds may be different. And with that, I'll say Chimigwech. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dr. Tricia McGuire-Adams and Ms. Linda Robinson. I think this gives us a lot to think about as students, practitioners, and community members. And I think we'll just open it up for questions. Yeah. Oh yeah, she's just on her way.
Thank you very much. That was very well presented. The question I have is, who do you see as optimal partners that have not been partners in the past that are potential partners for the future that could move things forward?
Well, there's so many partners. Like we need, of course, the Indigenous community to be on board. The levels of government, both federal and provincial. Like even the city can get involved. Hey, how the sports facilities are set up and how Indigenous disabled individuals are able to utilize them. You know, how to sort of form partnerships that would allow people in Indigenous communities better access to those facilities that are in the larger system. Like, so I don't think it could be just one organization or one level of government that needs to be the person that's going to solve it all. I think it's a whole community effort, and I think that goes back to what Tricia was saying. I mean, that's part of our culture. It's not for me to go and say, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. Our culture is, okay, how as a community, how is all of us together going to work and solve this solution and make the changes so that everybody has their place?
Thank you very much, Linda and Tricia. It's so nice to see you and do such a fine job of presenting today. I've spent 50 years of my life now working with people with a disability, and one of my very close friends is Grand Chief Willie Littlechild from Treaty 6, and we talk so often about Indigenous people living with an impairment, and where can we start? What's practical? I mean, at the center that we have here at the university over the last 40 years, we have many Indigenous people living with this impairment that come to the center, but they happen to also be the ones living in the city, so it's much easier. And I know that likely the important thing that we're going to have to realize is getting out to the reserves and working with programs and the community there. But I'm not Indigenous, you know. I like to think I'm close to it with Jay Wilton, but I'm not. And so I need help to understand as to where to go, what to do, and how can we make a more important impact and legacy in the lives of Indigenous people living with an impairment.
Okay, well, it wouldn't be realistic for like centers like the Steadward Center to be set up in Indigenous communities. So, you know, how can we work with centers like the Steadward to ensure that our people with disabilities have access to those communities? And so I think that's the question that we need to ask and the question that we need to work on, you know? Like, because and I think it goes back again to working as a community, collaborating and finding solutions for that'll work for everyone. And like Enoch is not that far from Edmonton. It just like butts right up against the city. So like solutions to get people with disabilities from Enoch to the Steadwork Center shouldn't be huge. But you have to have that conversation first, like, you know, with the chief and council, you know, someone that can make those kinds of decisions. And there are, like, you know, just in the Edmonton area, there are 4 or 5 reserves that are within an hour, 45 minutes. So, you know, I think the first step would be to talking to the chief and council on those various reserves and see if there's a way that solutions can be worked out so that, you know, because like I said earlier, it wouldn't be viable to, you know, set up centers like the Steadwork and in all of the reserves. But how can we gather those people that don't live in the Greater Edmonton area, bring them into the city or closer to a larger facility that has those kinds of resources?
Thanks for your presentation. I was using the crayons to sort of jot down a bunch of the words that I was listening to, things like ethics of reciprocity and things like that. One of the words that I'm really drawn to is that word unraveling. And I'm wondering if you can speak more to that word actually in the context of Indigenous peoples and moving forward, and then maybe we can also start thinking about that in terms of our thinking around disability.
Sure. Colonization is, like anything, very complex. It's not just operated in a dichotomy. So when I say unraveling, it's a way to think through the complexities of colonization, settler colonialism, and also decolonization. So if I speak from my own perspective, as an Anishinaabe woman, raised in what is currently Canada, going to school in what is currently Canada, I have grown up being colonized. I'm speaking the English language. I'm not speaking Anishinaabe Moin. So for me, unraveling is very much an effort for myself to personally decolonize from the impacts of colonialism on my being. So unraveling how some of my thoughts, some of my beliefs have been complicated and formed by my existence in living in what is now Canada. And simultaneously, I also include that word regeneration, because as Indigenous folks in what is now Canada, we still exist. And we're fortunate to have our languages, our teachings, still available, but it's hard work to relearn. So I use regeneration in addition to the term unraveling to couple those two processes. And I think when we apply that to Indigenous understandings of disability, that same process might apply in terms of unraveling how there has been this disruption of love and support and kindness to our members who live with impairment, and through the colonization process we have now treating them potentially within a Western disabled framework. So I feel that unraveling bit can be applied in many different ways.
So is it appropriate for me as a cisgendered, white, non-disabled settler woman to use that term unraveling in terms of reframing, rethinking, and re-understanding what it means to experience disability?
Absolutely, yes. 100% yes. So the hard work of decolonization does not just rest on the shoulders of Indigenous folks, it's all of our responsibility. Ally is an action-oriented word, so we have to, as people in Canada, if we want to take up this conversation differently, it requires hard work, it requires action, and it requires a lot of unsettling questions and action.
Is that it for questions? I don't see any more hands. Okay. Thank you to our speakers and for everyone for attending. Our next session is removing barriers faced by LGBTQ participants at, I think, 1:45. So if you could just give a round of applause for our speakers, that'd be great.